a werewolf romance written by Olivia Smith. The night they dragged me through the throne room doors, I was bleeding from 3 places and praying to die quickly. My knees hit the cold stone floor so hard I heard something crack. The chains around my wrists were still warm from the forge. They had made them fresh, just for me. I could smell burning iron in my hair. Around me, the wolves of the Ashenvale court stood in perfect silence, watching me the way predators watch something already dead. I had spent my entire life hiding what I was. I had starved for it. I had bled for it. I had watched people I loved walk away so they would never be caught standing beside me. And in the end, none of it mattered. They found out anyway. I lifted my head one last time, not out of pride, but because I refused to meet death staring at the floor. That was when I saw him. The king. And everything I thought I knew about that night shattered into pieces I am still finding today. Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country, and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France, I want to know. Don't just sit back. Tell me where in the world you are. Now, let's dive into the story. Chapter 1. The Dragging. The hands that grabbed me were not gentle. They never are, when the thing they are grabbing is something they believe has no right to exist. It was Soren who found me first. Soren with his pale eyes and his hunter's smile, the kind of smile that never reaches anywhere near warmth. He had been tracking me for 6 days through the Mirewood, and I had made it farther than anyone expected a woman alone to make it. I had crossed 2 rivers. I had slept inside a hollowed oak with my knees pressed to my chest, and my heartbeat loud in my ears. I had eaten berries that turned my tongue black and drunk rainwater from cupped bark. I had survived every single thing the forest threw at me. The cold, the wolves that were not men, the silence that presses on you like a hand. And then I stepped into a clearing just before dawn, and Soren was already standing there, waiting, with 6 Ashenvale guards fanned out behind him, like a sentence I had been running from my whole life. He looked at me the way you look at something you've already decided the fate of. "Zephrine," he said, and the way he said my name made it sound like a crime. I did not run. My legs had nothing left. I stood there in the gray pre-dawn light, mud to my knees, my dark hair matted against my face, and I thought, this is it. This is where the running ends. They did not put me on a horse. That would have been too dignified. They bound my wrists with fresh forged chains that bit into the skin, and they walked me. 30 miles through the Mirewood and out onto the stone road that leads to Ashenvale's capital, Varath. I walked every step of it. Soren rode beside me the entire way, never speaking, just watching with that pale satisfaction he wore like a coat. The guards behind me were not silent. They murmured to each other, sharp words I was meant to hear. Half-blood, abomination, pretender. Each word landed like a small stone against something already bruised. I kept my eyes on the road. I counted my steps the way my mother taught me to count when the fear got too big. 1, 2, 3, breathe. 4, 5, 6, breathe. She had taught me that when I was 5 years old, and the village children had cornered me behind the grain store and pulled my hair to see if I would shift. I hadn't. I had stood there and counted, and breathed, and survived. I was still doing it 20 years later. The road stretched ahead of me like punishment made physical, and I walked it with my chin level, because it was the only thing I had left to control. Varath hit me like a wall. I had never seen it. I had spent my whole life in border villages specifically, so I would never have to come anywhere near it. The city was enormous, and gray, and proud, built from the same dark stone as the mountain it pressed against, with towers that caught the afternoon light and held it like an accusation. The people lined the road when they brought me through the gates. Word had traveled faster than we had. Someone had sent a rider ahead, and now they stood 2 and 3 deep on either side, watching me pass. I heard a child ask her mother what I was. I heard the mother say something low and sharp. I did not look at their faces. I looked at the cracks between the cobblestones, and I counted. 1, 2, 3, breathe. And I thought of my mother's hands, The way they smelled like pine resin and earth, and I kept walking because that was all there was to do. The throne room doors were black iron banded with silver. Silver, always silver. The metal that burns us. The metal that says you are not safe here in a language older than words. They swung open without anyone touching them, moving on some mechanism I couldn't see, and the sound they made was low and final, like a stone rolling across a grave entrance. Inside, the hall was lit with hundreds of candles in iron chandeliers, and the light they made was gold and wavering, and it turned every face in that room into something ancient and unfamiliar. There were perhaps 200 wolves standing in that hall, the full court of Ashenvale, nobles and warriors and advisors, and the simply curious, all of them turned toward the doors, toward me. I could feel their combined gaze like pressure on my sternum. Soren's hand found my shoulder and shoved, and I stumbled forward onto the stone floor, and my knees hit so hard the crack of it echoed, and I heard someone in the crowd make a sound of satisfaction, and I thought, do not give them your tears. Whatever you give them, do not give them that. I lifted my head. At the far end of the hall, on a throne carved from a single piece of black mountain stone, sat a man I had heard described in terrified whispers my entire life. King Kadrin of Ashenvale. He was younger than the stories made him, not ancient, not monstrous, not the gray-bearded tyrant of border village nightmares. He was perhaps 30, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair and a face that was composed in a way that looked like it had been composed through considerable effort and considerable pain. He wore no crown. Just a dark jacket and the stillness of someone who has never needed to prove anything, because nothing has ever successfully threatened him. He was looking at me, not at the chains, not at the blood on my temple, at me, at my face. And something happened in his expression that I did not have a name for yet. A shift, subtle and seismic, like the first tremor before the mountain moves. His lips parted, and across 30 feet of cold stone and 200 watching wolves, in a voice meant only for me, he said one word. Mine. Chapter 2. How it began. I was born in a village called Dunrath, at the edge of the Mirewood, where the trees grow so close together that noon looks like dusk, and dusk looks like the end of the world. My mother was a healer, fully human, small-boned and precise, with clever hands and a mind like a locked chest that only she had the key to. She never told me who my father was, not in words, but I had her eyes exactly, brown, with flecks of amber, and everything else I got from someone she never named, including the thing that made us run. I shifted for the first time at age 7, alone in the forest behind our house, chasing a rabbit I had no intention of catching. One moment I was a girl in a worn blue dress, and the next I was on 4 legs with the whole world smelling like a map, and I was so startled I shifted back immediately and sat in the dirt, hyperventilating until my mother found me. She did not scream. She did not cry. She knelt in the dirt beside me in her good apron, and she looked at me for a long time, and then she said, "All right, then we learn how to be careful." That was my mother. She turned catastrophe into curriculum. She held my face in both her hands, and she said, "Zephyrin, you are not a mistake. But the world will try to tell you that you are. Don't let it." I was 7. I didn't entirely understand, but I held on to those words like a stone in my fist, and I held them still 20 years later, on my knees on a throne room floor. We moved 6 times before I turned 15. Each time it was the same, some small slip, some moment where the fear got too large and the control slipped, and then the whispers would start, and my mother would pack our things in the dark before dawn, and we would walk to the next village. She never complained. She built a new life each time with the same quiet efficiency, hanging her dried herbs in whatever new window we had, setting her healing tools on whatever new table, learning whatever new neighbors' names. I watched her do it over and over, and I thought, how is she not broken? How does she start over with the same hands every time? I asked her once, on the road between Dunrath and the next place, when I was 10, and my feet hurt, and I was angry in the way children are angry when they don't have words for grief. She thought about it for a long time before she answered. "Because you're walking beside me," she said. That's enough reason. I carried that answer for the rest of my life, and I'm still not sure I deserved it. The last village we lived in together was called Thresh, and we were there for 4 years, which was the longest we had ever stayed anywhere. I was 19 when we arrived, old enough to be useful, to help with the healing work, to learn enough control that the slipping became rare. My mother had a gift for making people trust her quickly. She had an honesty that was visible in her face, a straightforwardness that put nervous people at ease. In Thresh, we had a small house with an actual garden, and she grew her own herbs, and for 4 years something almost like normal pressed its face against our window and breathed warmly on the glass. I learned to live small and quiet. I learned to need very little. I learned that the edges of things, the edges of villages, the edges of forests, the edges of other people's lives were the safest places for someone like me. I became expert at being almost invisible. Not entirely, just enough. My mother died in the winter I turned 23. Fever. Ordinary, devastating human fever. The kind that didn't care that her daughter could shift into something that could run down a deer. I sat beside her for 9 days, and I used every remedy she had ever taught me, and none of it was enough, because the truth about healers is that they pour everything into other people, and keep very little for their own emergencies. She died on a gray morning with my hand in both of hers and her eyes on my face. And the last thing she said to me was the same thing she had said when I was 7. "You are not a mistake." I did not cry until I had buried her. Then I sat beside the mound of turned earth and I cried for 3 days, and when I stopped, I was someone slightly different. The way fire leaves wood changed even when it doesn't consume it entirely. I stayed in Thresh 6 more months. Then the whispers started again. Not about me, this time. About my mother. About what she must have been, to have raised something like me. And that was the thing that finally made me run. They could say what they wanted about me. They could not have her memory. I ran north, toward the border territories, toward the scattered villages where people minded their own survival too closely to mind anyone else's business. I was good at surviving alone by then. My mother had made sure of that, teaching me practical things alongside the healing, how to read weather and cloud formations, how to find water in dry terrain, which plants could be eaten, and which would stop your heart. I found work easily, moving from place to place, never staying long enough to become a story. I learned to trust no one fully, to like people carefully, to keep the soft parts of myself locked away in the same internal chest my mother had kept her locked parts. For 3 years it worked. I was nobody. I was invisible. I was safe. And then, 6 days before Soren found me in that clearing, a woman in a market in a border town called Veld looked at me too long and too carefully, and I saw her lips form a word I recognized from the shape of it alone. Half-blood. And I ran. I ran because I always ran. I just didn't know that time that I was running directly toward the thing that would change everything. Chapter 3, what I was running from there, is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes not from the body, but from the will, from the sustained effort of being something the world has decided it does not want. I had carried that exhaustion for so long that I had stopped recognizing it as unusual. It was simply the weight of being me, distributed evenly across my bones, present every morning when I opened my eyes, and still there every night when I closed them. In the border village of Veld, for approximately 8 months, I had almost forgotten it was there. That is what makes the forgetting dangerous. You relax, just slightly, just enough, and then something reaches through the gap and reminds you exactly what you are. The woman in the market was named Tessely. I know that now. I know a great many things now that I didn't know then. But in the moment she looked at me across a table of dried apricots and mouthed that word, I only knew one thing. She had seen something in my face, in my movement, in whatever indefinable quality it is that gives us away to those who know what to look for. And once one person sees it, the rest follow like a tide. I left Veld with 3 hours' notice and a pack that weighed 40 pounds. I did not say goodbye to the family I'd been lodging with, a broad-shouldered woodcutter named Bram, and his wife Orla, and their 4 children, because saying goodbye would have required explanation. and explanation would have required truth, and truth would have put them in the path of whatever was coming for me. That is the calculus you learn to do automatically. When you live the way I lived, who can you afford to damage by proximity? The answer, always, is no one. So I left in the gray hour before dawn, moving north along the Mirewood's edge, angling toward the deeper forest where tracking becomes difficult. I had a plan, loosely assembled: cross the Mirewood, reach the far northern settlements, find work that didn't require community, survive another year. I had survived this many times before. The plan had always worked. I told myself it would work again. I told myself this all the way into the forest, and I believed it with everything I had, right up until the moment Soren was standing in my clearing with his pale eyes and his pre-written ending. What I didn't know, what I could not have known, running alone through the dark trees with my 40-pound pack and my careful, well-practiced fear, was that Tessely had not just mouthed a word. She had sent a rider to Vareth within the hour. She was, as I later learned, one of the Ashenvale's informal network of watchers, people placed in border villages specifically to identify and report anomalies. Half-bloods were at the top of the anomaly list. They had been since the Accord of Gravane, which I knew about in the vague way you know about laws that were designed to eliminate you. The Accord said that half-bloods, wolves born of human-wolf unions, were to be registered, monitored, and if found unregistered, brought to the capital for adjudication. Adjudication was a civilized word for something that was rarely civilized in practice. The last adjudicated half-blood I had heard of had been put to death in the courtyard of Vareth's outer wall, publicly, as a demonstration of the Accord's teeth. I had known this. I had organized my entire life around never being adjudicated. And still, here we were. Soren had ridden hard from Vareth when the rider arrived, 6 days to intercept me, which meant he had moved fast and known the forest well. I thought about that, in the long walk to Varath, the chains warm on my wrists. He had known where I was going, had known the Mirewood better than I did, had probably been tracking my general movement from multiple reports, multiple watchers, the whole invisible infrastructure of control that I had somehow managed to stay ahead of for 23 years, and then, exhausted and grieving and slightly less careful than I should have been, had finally stumbled into. I was not stupid. I understood how it had happened. The understanding didn't make it less devastating. I had spent my life being careful, and it had not been enough, and that particular failure had a specific taste, sharp and metallic, like biting the inside of your cheek. I cataloged it as I walked. I filed it beside everything else. I kept counting 1, 2, 3, breathe, and I kept my chin level, and I walked toward Vareth and toward whatever death waited for me there, and I thought about my mother's hands, and I tried to feel something other than the crushing weight of too late. Here is what I knew about King Kadrin of Ashenvale, assembled from years of careful listening in border villages where people say things they think no one important is hearing. He had taken the throne at 22, which was young enough that most of the court had expected to manage him, to use him as a figurehead, while the real power shifted behind him like water under ice. That had not happened. Within a year, he had consolidated power in ways that surprised everyone, quietly removing 3 advisors who had grown too comfortable, and replacing them with people whose loyalty was to him specifically rather than to the institution of the throne. He was described as cold, exacting, and unpredictable, a combination that kept even his allies slightly off balance. He had never taken a mate, which was unusual for a wolf king his age, and the reasons for that were speculated about endlessly in the kind of hushed, excited tones that meant no one actually knew. He had enforced the Accord of Gravane without mercy or exception. He was the thing I had been running from, made flesh and seated on a throne. And yet, when I lifted my head on the throne room floor, when I met his eyes across 30 feet of cold stone and 200 watching wolves, the word he said was not execute. It was not remove, or confirm sentence, or any of the civilized words for elimination. He said mine. And the way he said it made the chains feel, for just one bewildering second, like they belonged to an entirely different story than the one I thought I was in. Chapter 4. Secrets beneath secrets. They put me in a room, not a cell, and that distinction mattered in ways I spent the entire night trying to understand. The room was in one of Vareth's inner towers, which meant stone walls and narrow windows, but also a bed, an actual bed with a frame and a mattress that was thin but present, and a table with a water basin and a cloth for washing. Someone had put a candle on the table. It was still burning when they pushed me inside and locked the door. I stood in the middle of the room for a long time, not moving, listening to the guard's footsteps retreat down the corridor, waiting for the sound to fully fade before I let myself breathe properly. Then I sat on the edge of the bed, and I put my still chained hands in my lap, and I looked at the candle, and I thought, very carefully and very methodically, about what the word mine meant from the mouth of a wolf king. Wolves are not metaphorical creatures. When they claim something, the claiming is biological, absolute, woven into the oldest part of what they are. I knew this the way I knew things about a nature I had spent my whole life suppressing. From the inside, from the bone-deep animal knowledge that my human half had learned to sit very quietly on top of. The word mine, from a wolf, meant recognition. It meant the bond, the mate bond, the thing our kind described in the same tones humans reserved for miracles and catastrophes. It meant he had looked at me, and every instinct in him had said her, which was impossible, which was, in fact, so far outside the architecture of the life I had built, that I sat on that bed for an hour, turning the impossibility over in my hands, before I was able to put it down. The chains came off before dawn. A guard I hadn't seen before. Quiet, efficient, with the careful movements of someone who has been told exactly what to do and intends to do exactly that. Unlocked them without meeting my eyes, and left without speaking. My wrists were raw underneath, rubbed to angry pink by the iron. I spent a long time pressing the cloth from the basin against them, feeling the cool water against the irritation, grounding myself in the small physical sensation, because the larger situation was still too large to hold all at once. Through the narrow window, I could see a slice of Vareth's pre-dawn sky, deep blue shading toward charcoal, and the tops of the dark stone towers, and a single bird moving in a straight line from one edge of my vision to the other. I watched it until it disappeared. I thought about my mother. I thought about the 6 days in the Mirewood. I thought about Soren's pale, satisfied eyes, and the crowd lining the road, and the iron doors swinging open, and the way Kadrin had looked at me. Not the way the crowd had looked at me, not with hunger, or contempt, or the bright-edged excitement of watching something be destroyed, with something that had no safe name, something I recognized from the inside, the way you recognize a sound you've only ever heard in your own chest. By mid-morning, someone arrived with food. Not a guard, a woman, older, with gray streaked dark hair pulled back severely, and the bearing of someone who has operated near power long enough to have absorbed some of its stillness. She set a tray on the table without ceremony, and then stood with her hands folded and looked at me with direct, assessing eyes that reminded me uncomfortably of my mother in her more serious moods. "Eat," she said. "The king will see you this afternoon." I looked at the tray. Bread, cheese, something that smelled like lentil soup, a cup of what turned out to be warm tea. Real food, not prisoner's food. I ate because refusing would have been pride performing for an empty audience, and I had long since learned to save my pride for the moments where it actually mattered. The woman watched me eat without speaking, and when I was done, she picked up the tray and turned to leave, and I said, "What is your name?" She paused. She looked at me over her shoulder. "Veska," she said. "I run the king's household." And then she left, and I sat with that information and the strange warmth of the soup in my stomach and tried to prepare myself for an afternoon that I had absolutely no framework for. Here is what I had not yet been told, what I would learn only in pieces over the days that followed, assembling it the way you assemble something broken in the dark. Kadrin had known about me for longer than Tessely's message. 3 months longer, in fact. There was someone in his court, I would find out who, eventually, who had been tracking Half-Blood reports for reasons entirely separate from the Accord's enforcement. Reasons that had to do with a prophecy that the Ashen Vale's records housed, and its king had read, and its court had kept quiet for 11 years. The prophecy was not elaborate. They rarely are, the true ones. It said only that the line of Ashen Vale would break unless it was joined to what it had exiled. Short enough to be memorized, vague enough to be debated, specific enough to be terrifying when you were the king who had spent 11 years enforcing the exile in question. I did not know any of this that morning. I sat in my tower room with my chafed wrists and my finished soup, and I thought I was waiting to be sentenced. I had no idea I was waiting for something else entirely, something that had been waiting for me for 11 years without my knowledge, patient and enormous and already inevitable, in the way that the things which change you most completely always seem, in retrospect, to have been inevitable from the very beginning. The afternoon came slow and gray through my narrow window. I washed my face. I combed my fingers through my still tangled hair. I straightened the only clothes I had, the travel-worn things I had been dragged through 30 miles of forest in. And I told myself, quietly, in the voice I used when the fear got very big, "You are not a mistake. Whatever comes through that door, you are not a mistake." The door opened. Veska stood in the frame. "The king is ready," she said. I stood. I breathed. I walked toward the door, and somewhere beneath the fear and the exhaustion and the confusion, something else moved. Something that had been asleep in me for a very long time. Something animal and alert, recognizing a direction the way a river recognizes a gradient. I walked toward the door. I walked toward him. And I had no idea yet that I was walking toward the answer to a question I had been asking my whole life without knowing I was asking it. Chapter 5. First Audience. The king's private meeting chamber was nothing like the throne room. It was smaller, warmer, lined with shelves of documents and maps, with a fire burning in a stone hearth that made the whole room smell like pine smoke and something darker underneath. Cedar, maybe, or the particular smell of old stone releasing heat. There were 2 chairs near the fire. One was occupied. Kadrin sat with his elbows on his knees, not in the posture of a king performing kingship, but in the posture of a man who had been thinking hard about something and hadn't quite finished. When I entered, he looked up. That look again, the one I didn't have a name for. I stopped 3 feet inside the door. Veska closed it behind me. We were alone, which I hadn't expected, and the aloneness of it made the room feel different than it should have. Not threatening, which I had braced for, but oddly intimate, like a conversation between 2 people who already know the important things about each other and are only now getting to the words. "Sit," he said. Not an order, an offering. I sat in the second chair because standing would have been another performance for an empty audience, and I was too tired to perform. The fire was warm on my left side. I put my hands in my lap and I waited. He looked at me for a long time before he spoke. Not the way the court had looked at me. Not assessing, not hostile, not hungry. He looked at me the way you look at something you recognize but can't immediately place. Something that exists at the edge of memory, where the knowing lives before the name does. I let him look. I had learned long ago not to fill silences with nervous speech. Silences properly used are information. This one told me he was uncertain, which was not what I had expected from a man described as cold and exacting. Uncertainty I could work with. Finally, he said, "Your name is Zephyrin." Not a question. "Yes," I said. "And your mother was Imara of Dunrath." Something cold moved through me. He knew my mother's name. He knew her village. He had known more than Tessely's message could have carried, and I had been right to feel in the tower room that the shape of things was larger than I'd seen. "She's dead," I said, because I couldn't think of any other response. "I know," he said, 3 years ago. And there was something in his voice, not sympathy exactly, something more complicated than sympathy, something with weight in it, that made me look at him more carefully. "You've been tracking me," I said. "Yes," he said. And then, unexpectedly, "I'm sorry it took this form." I did not know what to do with an apology from a king who had chained me and dragged me through his city. I looked at the fire. I looked at my hands. I said, "What happens to me now?" He was quiet long enough that I looked back at him. He was watching the fire. His profile in the firelight was severe and tired and younger than the court had made him look. 30, I had thought in the throne room, and I was right. Barely. Maybe 31. He said, "That depends on several things." "On the accord," I said. "You've enforced it." on every other case, like mine. Yes, he said, and I would tell you that was a mistake, but I imagine you'd prefer honesty to apology right now. I stared at him. This was not a conversation I had constructed in any of the versions of this meeting I had run through in my tower room. Why are you telling me that? I said. He turned from the fire and looked at me directly, and in the firelight, his eyes were not the flat, commanding eyes of Court. They were the eyes of someone whose interior life was considerably more complicated than his exterior suggested. Someone managing a great deal of information and feeling, and letting almost none of it into his face, except in moments like this, alone, when the performance could rest. Because, he said, I need you to trust me enough to hear what I'm about to tell you, and I know that's asking an enormous thing, so I'm starting with honesty, because it's the only currency I have that might actually buy anything from you. He told me then about the prophecy. Not all of it. Not yet. He told me the outline. That the Ashenvale line had known for 11 years that something was coming, that the exile of half-bloods would not protect them from, that in fact the exile was creating the very fracture the prophecy warned against. He told me that half-bloods had been specifically included in the Accord, not because they were dangerous, but because there was something about their dual nature that an older fear in the Court could not tolerate. The fear of mixture, of border, of the thing that belonged to two worlds, and therefore, in the Court's logic, could be fully claimed by neither. He told me that he had inherited the Accord from his father, and enforced it because dismantling it in the first year of his reign would have cost him the Court's support before he had enough of his own consolidated to survive without it. He told me all of this in a measured, careful voice, the voice of a man recounting decisions he has examined from every angle, and found flawed and cannot unfind. I listened. When he was done, I said, "So what am I? In the prophecy?" He looked at me. The firelight moved on his face. He said, "The joining." I looked back at him for a long moment. The fire snapped. Somewhere outside the narrow windows, Vareth was alive with its evening sounds, distant and muffled. I said, "I don't know whether to believe you." "I know," he said. "That's fair." "I was dragged here in chains," I said. "I know," he said. "I'm sorry." I looked at the fire. Then I said the thing that surprised us both. "Tell me more." The conversation went until the candles burned low. He told me about the Court, who was loyal, who was performing loyalty, who would oppose any change to the Accord openly, and who would oppose it in the dark. He told me about the 3 advisors he had removed in his first year, and why, and what he had replaced them with. He told me about the political architecture of Ashenvale, the way you describe a building you have been living in long enough to know exactly where the walls are thin. I listened to all of it, and I said almost nothing, partly because I was still assembling my understanding of where I was and what was happening, and partly because I was watching him, his hands when he talked, the way his jaw worked when he said something he found difficult, the moments when the measured voice dropped into something more human, and then was retrieved and steadied again. He was, I was beginning to understand, a man who had done many things he didn't like in service of holding something together that he believed was worth holding. That was a kind of person I recognized, not because I had been one, because I had been made by one. My mother had spent 23 years doing things she didn't like to protect something she believed was worth protecting. I looked at Cadron of Ashenvale in the low candlelight, and I thought, I do not trust you yet, but I think I understand what you are. And then, beneath that thought, quieter, something I was not ready to say even to myself. The bond is real. I feel it. I have felt it since the throne room. It is running under everything like water under ice, real and cold and moving, and I do not know yet what to do with it. But it is there. Chapter 6. What the Court sees. By the second morning, Vareth knew something had shifted. I could feel it in the way the air moved through the corridors when Veska walked me from my tower room to the smaller dining chamber where Cadron had arranged for me to eat. Not the Great Hall, not yet, but not my room either. And in between, a transitional space which was itself a message to the Court. Not prisoner, not guest, something being decided. Courts are exquisitely sensitive to in-betweens. Courts run on category and hierarchy, and the implicit agreement that everyone knows their place. And the moment something appears that doesn't fit the established categories, the whole organism goes on alert. I could feel the alert. It had a particular texture, not hostile yet, precisely. More like the stillness before hostility, the held breath before the deciding. Eyes followed me in corridors and pulled away before I caught them fully. Conversations paused at doorways and resumed at lower volumes once I had passed. I had spent my life being sensitive to exactly this kind of atmospheric shift, and I read it now the way a ship's pilot reads weather, with respect, and without panic, and with careful attention to the direction it was moving. Soren found me on the second afternoon. I was in a corridor near the library. I had asked Veska if there was somewhere I could read, and she had shown me the library without comment, which I took as another data point about the nature of my in-between status. And I was coming around a corner with a book about Ashenvale's territorial history, which I had chosen because knowing the landscape of a place is always useful, when he was simply there. Still with the pale eyes, still with the smile that didn't reach anywhere warm. He looked at me, and the smile sharpened, and he said, "Settling in." Not a question. I stopped. I looked at him and thought, very carefully, what does he want? What does he know? What does he want me to think he knows? "Walking," I said. "Same as you." He looked at the book in my hands. "Studying us?" he said. "Learning context," I said. Something moved in his expression. A flash of something that was not the controlled hunter's calm he'd worn in the Mirewood. Something less comfortable. "You should be careful," he said, still with the smile, "about the assumptions people in this court might make, about a half-blood who has the king's ear." "I'll keep that in mind," I said. He held my gaze a moment longer than was comfortable, and then he moved past me, and I stood in the corridor with my territorial history book and my pulse measured and deliberate, and I thought, he's not warning me. He's frightened. Something about this situation frightens Soren, and that is extremely interesting. That evening, Kadrin came to my room rather than summoning me. He knocked, which surprised me enough that I opened the door slightly later than I should have. He stood in the corridor with 2 cups of something steaming, and the expression of a man who has made a decision he is not entirely comfortable with, and has decided to proceed anyway. "May I come in?" he said. I stepped back. He came in and set one of the cups on my table, and sat in the chair by the window with the other, and for a moment we were just 2 people in a small room with the sounds of the city coming through the narrow window, and a candle making uncertain shadows on the stone walls. "Soren spoke to you," he said. Not a question. He had people watching, which I had assumed. "Yes," I said. "He's frightened," he said. "Yes," I said. "Of what, exactly?" He looked into his cup. "Of what changes," he said. "When the court knows what you are to me." I looked at him. There it was. The thing we had been moving around in the conversation by the fire. The thing neither of us had named directly. "And what am I to you?" I said. "Exactly. In your own words." He looked up from his cup. His eyes in the candlelight were the color of deep water, the color of the Mirewood before dawn. He said, "Everything I didn't plan for, and everything the prophecy said would come." I sat with that for a moment. Outside, Vareth moved through its evening, distant voices, the sound of horses on the cobblestones, something that might have been music from very far away. "The court will not accept this," I said. "Not easily." "No," he agreed. "Soren will move against it." "Yes. He has allies. Several." I looked at him. "You knew this would happen. You brought me here anyway." He set his cup down on the windowsill. He looked at me with something that was very close to stripped, the measured voice and the careful face pulled back to reveal something more essential, something that had been managing itself under significant pressure for a very long time. "I enforced the accord for 8 years, he said. "I sent people like you to... I made choices that I told myself were necessary. And then I read the prophecy, really read it, and I understood what I'd been doing and why it was wrong, and I thought, there is no correction that doesn't require cost. So," he spread his hands, "cost." I looked at his hands. They were not a courtier's hands. They had calluses from weapons training, a scar along the right thumb that was old and well-healed. They were the hands of someone who had actually done things, not just directed them. I thought about my mother. I thought about the way she had turned catastrophe into curriculum. "Tell me," I said, "what you need me to do." He told me. It was more than I had expected. He was not asking me to simply exist as proof of concept, to be the half-blood the king kept alive to demonstrate a change in policy. He was asking me to be part of the actual work of changing it, to attend court, to be visible, to let the court look at me and find, over time, that looking did not kill them. To be the thing that didn't fit their categories until their categories shifted to accommodate it. He was asking me to absorb the cost of being the proof, and he knew what he was asking. I could see that he knew in the careful way he presented it, with space for refusal, with nothing in his voice that resembled pressure. "You can say no," he said at the end. "I won't. This isn't a second set of chains." I looked at him. I thought about 30 miles in iron. I thought about Soren's pale eyes. I thought about my mother sitting in the dirt beside me when I was 7, holding my face. "You are not a mistake, but the world will try to tell you that you are." I had spent 23 years not trying to change the world's mind. I had spent 23 years surviving it. Maybe those were not the only two options. "All right," I said. "Show me what it looks like." Chapter 7. The Court's Teeth Court was a performance, and I had always known it from the outside, the way border village people talked about it, the distant shimmer of power dressed in ceremony. From the inside, it was the same performance viewed from the stage, which changes everything. The great hall of Ashenvale's court was 30 feet of cold stone and 200 wolves and candles that never quite lit all the shadows. And the first morning, Kadrin brought me in. Not dragged, not in chains, walking beside him, which was its own statement to every pair of eyes in that room. The silence that fell had a weight to it I felt in my sternum. They looked at me. I looked back. Kadrin's hand was at the small of my back, not touching, just present, close enough that I could feel the warmth of it, and that deliberate nearness was the loudest thing in the room. He took me to his right-hand position, which was where his future mate would stand, where a formal announcement had not yet been made, but where the positioning said everything that words were still choosing. I stood there and breathed, and looked out at the court, and felt the bond humming under my sternum like a second heartbeat, low and steady, and increasingly impossible to misread. I did not smile. I did not perform comfort I didn't feel. I stood there and was exactly what I was, and I let them look, and I thought, this is what my mother meant. Not running from it. Standing in it. Soren moved on the third day. I had known he would move soon. The frightened ones always do. They don't have the patience that the merely hostile have. He chose a council session, which was clever. A formal setting with witnesses and protocol, where a direct move against me would look like legitimate concern, rather than personal threat. He presented his case with the careful language of law, the Accord of Gravane, its provisions, the precedent of its enforcement, the risk of its relaxation. He cited 3 specific previous cases. He cited territorial security concerns. He spoke for 8 minutes in a measured, legal voice, and the substance of what he said was, "She should not be here, and the king is compromised." He didn't say that last part directly. Courts never say the direct thing. But every wolf in that room heard it, because wolves are built to hear the thing under the words. I sat 2 seats from Kadrin, and I listened to my own existence argued against in parliamentary language, and I kept my breathing even, and my hands still in my lap. 1, 2, 3, breathe, the way my mother had taught me, and I did not give Soren the satisfaction of a visible reaction. When he finished, the room was quiet. Then Kadrin said, "Thank you, Soren. Zephyrin, would you like to respond?" The room went very still. Council members did not typically speak in council unless they were council members, and I was not anything with an official name yet, in the careful political geography of Ashenvale. Kadrin was giving me the floor, which was a move so unexpected that it recalibrated the room's understanding of what was happening before I said a word. I stood. I looked at Soren. He looked back at me with pale, expressionless eyes. I said, the Accord of Gravane was written in response to a fear, not a fact. The fear was that half-bloods represent a border that pack law doesn't know how to manage. The fact is that borders are where things grow. I paused. I said, I have spent 23 years being the thing the Accord was written to eliminate. I know more about surviving in the territories of this kingdom than most people in this room, because surviving was the only option available to me. That knowledge doesn't make me dangerous. It makes me useful. If the court can find a way to be interested in useful rather than afraid of different, I think we will all find the next few years considerably more productive. I sat down. The room was still. Then, from somewhere to my left, a single council member, older woman, sharp eyes, someone I had not yet identified, said very quietly, "Well," and the room began to breathe again. Soren came to me that night. No guards, no witnesses. He came to the corridor outside my room, alone, and he knocked. And when I opened the door, he looked at me with something that was not the hunter's smile, and not the pale contempt, and not the frightened calculation. It was something rawer. He said, "You spoke well today." I looked at him. "You didn't mean what you said in council," I said. "You know the accord is flawed." Something crossed his face. He said, "What I know and what I can afford to do with what I know are different things." "Yes," I said. "I'm familiar with that problem." He looked at me for a long moment. He said, "Kadrin is going to make enemies for you. People with more resources than me." "I know," I said. "Why are you telling me?" He looked at the floor. He looked at me. He said, "Because I tracked you for 6 days through the Mirewood, and in 6 days of watching how you moved and how you survived and what you chose to do when you thought no one was watching, I know what you are, and I don't think you deserve what's coming." I looked at him for a long time. Then I said, "Tell me who to watch." He told me. He gave me 3 names. He gave me more than that. He gave me the texture of each threat, the motivation, the likely approach. He gave me the map of the danger I was moving into. And then he left, and I stood in my doorway with 3 names written in my memory, and the complicated feeling of having been surprised by someone I had filed under simple. The bond between Kadrin and me had no privacy. This is something I had not fully understood. I had known intellectually that the mate bond was biological and that both parties felt it, but I had not understood how it functioned in practice, how it created a channel of emotional information that was neither voluntary nor suppressible. I began to understand it on the 4th night, when I woke at 2 a.m, with a cold clarity that was not my own emotion, a focused, alert coldness that was coming from somewhere else in the castle, from him, from some middle-of-the-night reckoning he was having alone. I lay in my bed and felt his wakefulness through the bond like a sound through a wall, clear enough to read, muffled enough to be ambiguous. He was afraid of something, not the political machinery of the court, not Soren, not the 3 names I had been given. Something older and quieter. I lay in the dark, and I thought about what a king who has done things he regrets might be afraid of in the quiet middle of the night. And I thought, he is afraid of whether he deserves this, of whether the bond is a gift he has earned, or a grace he hasn't. And that particular fear, unlike most of the others in this story, was one I recognized from the inside with no distance at all. Chapter 8, The Fracture Line. The threat from the 3 names came faster than Soren had implied. The first was a council lord named Varek. Old money, old fear, the kind of man whose opposition to change is not ideology, but identity, because what he is has been built on what things have always been. He moved through financial pressure, withdrawing the Varek lands' grain tithe in protest of my presence in the court, which was legal and calculated to demonstrate that my presence had a cost the kingdom would feel. Kadrin absorbed it without visible reaction, which told me he had anticipated it and prepared. But the absorption cost something. I could feel it through the bond, a low-grade strain, the feeling of managing multiple structural problems simultaneously and using resources you'd planned to use elsewhere. The second name moved socially, a noblewoman called Mira, who began a quiet campaign among the court women to exclude me from the informal gatherings and alliances that are in any court, where the real decisions get pre-negotiated before the formal ones. She was subtle, and she was effective, and within a week I was eating alone in the smaller dining chamber, not because I was excluded from the Great Hall, but because the Great Hall had rearranged itself around me in a way that made presence there feel like standing in the middle of a room where all the furniture has been moved 6 inches from where it should be. Off. Wrong. designed to make you feel the absence without being able to name it specifically. The third name was the one that frightened me. Draveth, a lord of the Eastern Territories, wealthy, territorial in the most literal sense, and connected, in ways Soren had outlined with careful precision, to the faction within the court that had not just enforced the accord, but believed in it. Not as policy, as theology. There were wolves in Ashen Vale who had built an entire spiritual framework around the idea of bloodline purity, who held the accord not as a law, but as a covenant, and Draveth was their patron, and their voice, and their money. He had said nothing in council. He had done nothing visible in the first week, but his silence had a quality to it that I recognized from the forest. The silence of something that has identified its prey and is adjusting its position before it moves. I told Kadrin. He already knew about Draveth. He had known long before me, but I told him what Soren had said, the specifics, and watched something happen in his face that was carefully managed and still slightly visible. The recognition of a threat he had been hoping to have more time before. "How long?" I asked. "I don't know," he said. "But we need to be further along before he moves." "Further along in what?" He looked at me. "In the court, knowing what you are to me, officially." I looked back at him. "Then do it," I said. "Make it official." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Are you sure?" And I thought quietly and completely about 23 years of running, about chains and 30 miles, and a throne room floor, about a candle left burning by someone who had prepared the room, about a king who knocked before entering, about a bond running under everything like water under ice, real and cold and moving, already mine, whether I named it or not. "Yes," I said. "I'm sure." The announcement came on a Thursday, in full court, with the sun coming through the high windows and making the stone floor look, for once, almost warm. Kadrin stood and said, in the formal language the court used for such declarations, that he had found his mate, and her name was Zephyrin, and she would be recognized as such by the court of Ashen Vale. He did not mention what I was. He did not hide it either. The court already knew, had known since the throne room. But he did not center it, did not make it the subject of the announcement, which was itself a political choice, a reframing. The subject is not what she is. The subject is who she is to me. The silence that followed was the deepest the court had produced since I arrived. Then Veska, standing near the wall, began to clap. Slowly, formally, the kind of clapping that is itself a declaration. And one by one, not all of them, not nearly all of them, but enough to make the silence feel less absolute. Other hands joined. Varric did not clap. Mira did not clap. Draveth, standing at the far end of the hall, watched with eyes that had gone very still, and in that stillness I read the decision being made, the timeline being set, and I thought, it's coming. Whatever he's been planning. It's coming now. It came 4 days later. Not Draveth directly. He was too careful for that. Too old a player. It came through a third party, a young wolf named Kale, who had no particular history of politics, but who had, apparently, enough desperation or debt or conviction to make himself available to be used. He came for me in the corridor outside the library, not alone, 4 others with him, all of them with the look of people who have committed to something and are now discovering that commitment is heavier than they anticipated. He told me I had until the next sunrise to leave Vareth, not Ashen Vale, Vareth specifically. He phrased it as concern. My presence was destabilizing. My safety could not be guaranteed if I remained. This was a warning for my benefit. It was none of those things. It was a test. Would I run? Would the half-blood who had spent 23 years running run again now when running was offered as the comfortable option? I looked at Kale and his 4 companions, and I looked at the hand shape of Draveth behind them like a shadow behind a shadow, and I thought about my mother's hands. I thought about a throne room floor and a word I hadn't expected. I thought about Veska clapping, slow and formal, the declaration of it. I said very clearly, no. And then, because I was done with running, I walked past them, through them, back the way I had come, to find Kadrin, and I told him everything, and we began to prepare for what was coming, together, for the first time, as what we actually were to each other. Chapter 9, The Reckoning. Draveth moved on a council day. Of course he did. He was, at his core, a man who understood the power of audience, who knew that a move made in full view of the court was a move that created its own momentum, because courts run on witnessed decisions, and the weight of what has been seen cannot be unseen. He presented a formal challenge to the mating declaration, not unprecedented, technically possible under old law, a provision written for exactly the kind of situation where the king's personal choices were argued to constitute a risk to the pack's well-being. He was precise and prepared, and had clearly spent the 9 days since the announcement building his case with the kind of focused, meticulous attention that I was forced to respect, even as I despised what it was in service of. He cited bloodline law. He cited the Accord. He cited 3 scholars who had written in decades past about the theological dimensions of pack purity. He cited Kadrin's own enforcement record as evidence of the standard the king himself had established, and then he argued that the king's current course constituted a deviation from that standard, severe enough to warrant challenge under the old provisions. He did this in front of 200 wolves and the full apparatus of Ashenvale's court, and when he finished, the room had the texture of a held breath, the pressure of 200 people waiting to see if the ground would hold. Kadrin stood. He did not reach for me, did not look at me. He stood alone, and I understood this was correct, that this was his moment to stand in, that what I needed to do was be still and let him. He said, "Lord Draveth has cited my own enforcement record. He's correct that I enforced the Accord. He's correct that I applied it without exception. He is also correct that this represents a standard I established. What Lord Draveth has omitted is that the purpose of leadership is not the preservation of the leader's consistency. It is the preservation of the pack." He paused. The room was completely silent. The Accord was written to manage a fear. The fear was that mixed blood meant divided loyalty. 23 years ago, a woman named Emara of Dunrath had a child with a wolf of this court, and that child was born with divided blood, and was forced, by the fear that produced the Accord, to spend her life running. Not because she was dangerous, because the Accord's authors were afraid of what they didn't understand. Another pause. I looked at my hands in my lap. "That child," he said, "knows more about survival in Ashenvale's territories than anyone on this council. She has crossed the Mirewood alone. She has maintained control of her nature, under conditions that would break most fully turned wolves. She has been dragged through my city in chains and sat in my council, and spoken with more dignity than most people who have never had a reason not to." He looked at Draveth. "The Accord is flawed. I enforced it because I believed the cost of dismantling it exceeded the cost of maintaining it. I was wrong, and I am correcting the error now." Draveth was not finished. I had known he wouldn't be. Men like Draveth don't build for 9 days and then accept a speech as conclusion. He said quietly, "There is another provision of the old law that Lord Kadrin has not addressed." He used the name without title, which was itself a declaration. The provision that states that a challenge to a mating declaration may be resolved through trial. The room's held breath became something sharper. Trial, the old kind, the wolf kind, not the council kind. Physical, public, decisive. He said, "I invoke the provision of Arath. The challenge stands until resolved through trial by combat." He looked at me then, for the first time directly, and his eyes were the eyes of someone who had calculated and found the calculation clean. Between the claimant, he meant Kadrin, and the challenger, he meant himself, and then with the precision of someone who had planned for every response. "Unless the maid herself wishes to stand in her own claim's defense." He said it lightly. "The way you say something you are certain no one will accept. The way you offer a door you are confident no one will walk through." The room turned toward me. I felt every pair of eyes. I felt Kadrin's presence to my left, felt the bond spike with something urgent and protective and beginning to speak. I put my hand briefly on his arm. I looked at Draveth. I said, "I accept." The reaction was immediate and overlapping. Voices from every direction, the controlled chaos of 200 wolves processing something they had not expected. Kadrin turned to me with an expression that was the most completely unmanaged thing I had seen on his face. Not anger, not calculation, something closer to terror. He said very quietly, "Zephyrin, I know," I said. "I know what I'm doing. He's one of the strongest fighters in the Eastern Territories. I know." "You don't have to. Kadrin." He stopped. I looked at him. I said, "He chose me as the alternative because he assumed I would refuse. He assumed I was still someone who runs. He doesn't know what I am. Let me show him." The room was still processing. Draveth was watching me with his very still eyes, and I could see behind the calculation the first tremor of something miscalculated. He had expected refusal. He had planned for refusal. The acceptance was not in his architecture. I stood. I looked at the court, all of them. Varek and Mira and Soren, with his pale eyes gone wide, and Veska near the wall, with her hands clasped, and the council members and the warriors, and the simply curious 200 wolves who had watched me be dragged through this room in chains, and were now watching something else entirely. "Name the field," I said to Draveth. "Name the time. I'll be there." I had 36 hours, and for the first time in 23 years, I had exactly nowhere left to run. I was exactly where I needed to be. Chapter 10. What Remains. The field they chose was the training ground behind Verath's outer wall. Open, flat, with gray morning light pressing evenly across the packed earth, and the entire court assembled on 3 sides like the walls of a room, watching. I had not slept. Not from fear exactly, from the particular alertness that comes when the body understands that everything it has learned over a lifetime has been preparing for a specific moment, and the moment is here. I had spent the 36 hours with Kadrin, who had insisted on reviewing everything with me. Draveth's fighting style, his strengths, the particular ways that powerful wolves with decades of formal training move, the tells that indicate a shift coming, the moments of maximum vulnerability in the recovery from a heavy strike. He had given me this information with the meticulous care of a man who was genuinely afraid and was channeling the fear into usefulness because it was the only thing he could do with it. I had listened to all of it. I had also spent 4 hours alone in my room, not thinking about technique, but doing something I'd not done since my mother died, sitting with the wolf half of myself, the part I had kept locked and controlled and suppressed for 23 years, and simply letting it be present, letting it breathe, letting it remember what it was. I walked onto the field in the gray morning light, and I thought, I am not a mistake. I have never been a mistake. I am exactly what I am, and today that is enough. Draveth entered from the opposite side. He was larger than I had fully registered in the council chamber, broad, heavily muscled, with the economical movement of someone who has done significant violence and learned from it. He looked at me across the field with his very still eyes, and I saw, now, the recalibration happening behind them. He had spent 36 hours adjusting his plan for the thing he had not anticipated, my acceptance, and he had arrived here with a revised strategy, which was to end this quickly, before I could make it into something symbolic, before the court could watch it long enough to feel something about it. Quick and decisive, and then the narrative he would build afterward. The half-blood was given the chance to fight for her claim, and she was found wanting, and the kingdom mourned, but law was law. I read all of this in the way he positioned himself at the field's edge, and I let him read whatever he expected to read in me, and I walked to my position, and the council lord, who had been designated to oversee, said the words, and it began. He was faster than I expected, and I was faster than he expected, and the first 30 seconds were an adjustment, both of us recalibrating in real time, which is the truest thing about combat. It never matches the plan. He shifted early, which I had predicted, and the wolf form he took was enormous, dark, with the particular solidity of a wolf who has been fully himself his entire life without compromise or suppression. I held my human form longer than he expected, longer than anyone expected. I could feel the surprise of it moving through the assembled court like wind through grass. And I used the shape difference. Smaller, more mobile, harder to pin. I moved around him rather than against him. I let him commit to strikes that didn't land and used the recovery time. My mother had taught me, in her practical way, that the point of surviving is not to be the strongest thing in the room. It is to be the thing still standing at the end. I was still standing at the end of the first minute, still standing at the end of the third. He was powerful and skilled, and he had 30 years of formal training, and I had 23 years of running. And what running teaches you, if you survive it, is how to find the geometry of any situation that keeps you alive. He shifted back to human form at the 7-minute mark, which was the moment I knew. Not because I had won yet, I hadn't, but because shifting back to human in the middle of combat is a tell. It means something has not worked the way it was supposed to, and the strategy is being abandoned for something improvised. He came at me with human speed and strength, and he was still formidable, and we were both bleeding from multiple places, and the assembled court was completely silent. And somewhere in that silence, I could feel Kadrin the way you feel weather, present, enormous, restrained, the bond between us pulled taut as a rope under load. I found the moment Soren had told me about in the geography of Draveth's movement, the left side, the old injury from a decade ago, the way he compensates by overextending on the right to protect it. I waited for it. When it came, I was already moving. It lasted 4 seconds. At the end of those 4 seconds, Draveth was on the ground, and I was standing, and I was breathing very hard, and the field was silent. Then Kadrin's voice, from where he stood at the field's edge, saying my name, not formal, not public, just my name, the whole of it, said the way you say the name of something you were afraid of losing. He came to me on the field, which was not protocol, and he didn't care, and in that moment I didn't care either. He stopped 3 feet from me, close enough to touch, far enough to give me the choice. And he looked at me the way he had looked at me in the private chamber by the fire, with everything managed pulled back to reveal what was underneath, which was simply, you. I looked at him in the gray morning light, bleeding and standing and alive, and I thought about my mother telling me I was not a mistake. I thought about 7 years old and 4 legs, and the whole world smelling like a map. I thought about 30 miles in chains and a candle left burning, and a man who knocked before entering. The bond between us was not a quiet hum now. It was fully present, warm and enormous and completely unambiguous, the oldest and most honest thing I had ever felt. Around us, the court was moving, adjusting, the witnessed thing becoming the new architecture of what was true and what was possible in Ashenvale. Veska began to clap. Then Soren, with his pale eyes, which I had not expected, and the surprise of it broke something open in my chest in a way that was not painful. Then others. Not all of them. Change never reaches everyone at once. But enough. Kadrin reached out and took my hand, carefully around the chain-chafed wrists, gentle in a way that had nothing to do with fragility, and everything to do with knowing what to touch carefully. "Done running?" he said. I looked at him. I looked at the court. I looked at Varath's dark towers against the morning sky, and the gray light, and the field where I had finally, completely, stopped. "Done running," I said. And that is where this story ends. Not with the running, but with the standing still. 23 years of chains, not all of them iron. And the one word that broke them all. If this story moved you, drop a comment with your country, and the time it is where you're watching. Like and subscribe so you never miss the next story. And remember, wherever you are in the world, whatever they told you that you were, you are not a mistake. Asterisk.